The stench of cordite hangs heavy in the air, a pungent mix of sulfur and smoke that sears the lungs and stings the eyes. The ground beneath your feet is a frozen, muddy quagmire, sucking the warmth from your boots as the icy grip of winter tightens its hold. The deafening noise is a living, breathing thing, a cacophony of artillery fire, screaming planes, and the staccato bursts of machine gun fire that threatens to consume you whole. You're not sure which direction the enemy's coming from, only that they're closing in, their footsteps echoing through the mist-shrouded landscape like the beat of a malevolent drum. Fear is a palpable thing, a cold sweat that trickles down your spine as you huddle in the trenches, waiting for the inevitable. The Allies are pushing forward, attempting to break the Nazi stranglehold on Europe, but the enemy is relentless, determined to hold their ground at all costs. You can feel the weight of history bearing down on you, the knowledge that the next 10 minutes will change the course of the war, and possibly the world. As you peer out into the chaos, you see the silhouettes of tanks looming in the distance, their cannons blazing as they churn through the mud and snow. The German Panzer IVs are formidable machines, their 75mm guns capable of tearing through even the thickest armor. But the Allies have a few tricks up their sleeve, including the ingenious inflatable decoys that have been deployed across the battlefield. These fake tanks, planes, and even entire military bases are designed to deceive the enemy, to draw their fire and disrupt their supply lines. The inflatable tanks, codenamed Operation Quicksilver, are the brainchild of the British military's Deception Unit, a shadowy organization tasked with confusing and misdirecting the enemy. Made of rubber and canvas, these decoys are remarkably realistic, complete with fake cannons and even mock radio transmissions. They're designed to be deployed quickly and easily, allowing the Allies to create the illusion of a much larger force than they actually have. And it's working. The Germans are taking the bait, pouring troops and resources into areas where the Allies have created these elaborate deceptions. But the Allies aren't the only ones using unconventional tactics. Deep behind enemy lines, Soviet guerrilla fighters are waging a brutal and effective campaign of sabotage and subterfuge. These shadowy figures, often dressed in civilian clothing and armed with little more than rifles and explosives, are targeting the Nazi supply lines, blowing up bridges and railways, and ambushing enemy patrols. They're a ghostly presence, seemingly everywhere and nowhere at the same time, striking without warning and then melting back into the shadows. The Soviets have a long history of using guerrilla warfare, dating back to the Russian Revolution and the subsequent Civil War. But during World War II, they've honed this tactic to a fine art, creating a network of underground fighters and sympathizers who are willing to risk everything to disrupt the Nazi war machine. These fighters are often led by seasoned veterans, men and women who have been fighting the Nazis since the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. They know the terrain, they know the enemy, and they know how to use the land to their advantage. As the battle rages on, you see the Soviet guerrilla fighters in action, moving stealthily through the trees, their faces blackened with soot, and their eyes gleaming with a fierce determination. They're armed with a mix of Soviet and captured German weapons, including the formidable PPSH-41 submachine gun, which is capable of firing 900 rounds per minute. They're also using improvised explosives, fashioned from everything from old artillery shells to scraps of metal and wire. The Nazis, on the other hand, are struggling to cope with the sheer scale and complexity of the Soviet guerrilla campaign. They're used to fighting conventional battles, where the enemy is clearly defined and the rules of war are straightforward. But the Soviets are playing by a different set of rules, using hit-and-run tactics, booby traps, and ambushes to whittle down the enemy's strength. The Nazis are also facing a severe shortage of troops and equipment, thanks in part to the Allied bombing campaign, which has targeted their supply lines and manufacturing centers. The Allies are using a range of aircraft to support their bombing campaign, including the iconic B-17 Flying Fortress, which is capable of carrying up to 4,000 pounds of bombs. The B-17 is a formidable machine, with a range of over 3,000 miles and a top speed of over 300 miles per hour. It's also heavily armed, with a dozen .50 caliber machine guns and a crew of 10 men. The B-17 is just one part of the Allied air campaign, which includes everything from fighter planes like the P-51 Mustang to transport planes like the C-47 Skytrain. As the battle reaches its climax, you see the B-17s soaring overhead, their engines roaring as they release their payload of bombs. The ground shakes beneath your feet as the bombs detonate, sending shockwaves through the mud and snow. The Nazis are trying to respond, sending up their own fighter planes to intercept the bombers. But the Allies have a technological edge, thanks to their development of radar and other electronic countermeasures. The Nazis, on the other hand, are struggling to keep pace, their own radar systems still in the experimental stages. The Soviet guerrilla fighters are also using technology to their advantage, employing everything from radio transmitters to coded messages to coordinate their attacks. They're also using the terrain to their advantage, hiding in the forests and mountains, where the Nazis are reluctant to follow. The Soviets know the land, they know the people, and they know how to use the environment to their advantage. They're waging a war of attrition, wearing down the enemy through 1,000 small cuts, rather than trying to land a single, decisive blow. As the 10 minutes tick by, the outcome of the battle is far from certain. The Allies are pushing forward, but the Nazis are refusing to yield. The Soviet guerrilla fighters are making their presence felt, but the enemy is adapting, trying to find ways to counter their tactics. The war is a complex, multifaceted thing, with many different players and many different agendas. But one thing is clear: the next 10 minutes will be crucial. A turning point in the conflict that will determine the course of history. The Allies are fighting for their lives, using every trick in the book to gain the upper hand. The Nazis are fighting for their ideology, determined to impose their twisted vision on the world. And the Soviet guerrilla fighters are fighting for their country, using every ounce of strength and cunning to drive the enemy back. The battle is intense, the stakes are high, and the outcome is far from certain. But one thing is clear: only one side can emerge victorious. As the sun rose over the horizon on that fateful day, the stage was set for one of the most pivotal battles in the history of World War II. The Allied forces, comprising of American, British, and Canadian troops, had been planning this operation for months, poring over maps, intelligence reports, and strategic briefings to ensure a decisive victory. The German army, however, was not about to give up without a fight, and their defenses were formidable. The morning phase of the battle began with a barrage of artillery fire from the Allied lines, aimed at softening up the German defenses and creating breaches in their lines. The Allies had amassed an impressive array of firepower, including the M4 Sherman tank, which would play a crucial role in the battle. The Sherman 75mm gun was capable of firing high-explosive shells that could blast through German fortifications, but it was no match for the German Tiger II tank. With its 88mm gun and heavily armored hull, the Tiger II was a formidable opponent, and the Allies knew they had to take it out if they were to have any chance of success. As the artillery barrage lifted, the Allied infantry began to move forward, supported by waves of tanks and aircraft. The Allies had developed a new tactic, known as the tank infantry team, where tanks would provide covering fire for the infantry as they advanced, while the infantry would provide anti-tank support to the tanks. This tactic proved to be highly effective, as the Germans were caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the Allied advance. However, the Allies soon encountered their first major obstacle: the German supply lines. The Germans had carefully planned their logistics, and their supply lines were well protected and efficient. The Allies, on the other hand, were struggling to keep up with the demand for ammunition, fuel, and food. The Germans had also implemented a clever tactic, known as the elastic defense, where they would retreat and regroup, only to counterattack when the Allies least expected it. This tactic put a huge strain on the Allied supply lines, as they had to constantly adjust their logistics to keep up with the shifting front lines. As the morning wore on, the Allies began to make gains, but at a heavy cost. The Germans were fighting fiercely, and their defenses were proving to be more resilient than expected. The Allies were also experiencing communication failures, as their radio networks were being jammed by German electronic countermeasures. This made it difficult for the Allies to coordinate their attacks, and they began to suffer from a lack of situational awareness. The afternoon phase of the battle saw the introduction of air power, as Allied aircraft began to pound German positions with bombs and strafing runs. The Allies had developed a new type of aircraft, the P-47 Thunderbolt, which was specifically designed for ground attack missions. The P-47 was heavily armored and armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns, making it a formidable opponent for German ground troops. The Germans, however, had their own air power, in the form of the Messerschmitt Bf 109, which was a highly maneuverable and heavily armed fighter aircraft. As the battle raged on, the Allies began to implement a flanking maneuver, aimed at outflanking the German defenses and cutting off their supply lines. The Allies had identified a weak point in the German lines, a small village that was lightly defended, and they decided to exploit it. A battalion of infantry, supported by a company of tanks, was tasked with taking the village and securing the surrounding countryside. The Germans, however, were not about to let the Allies have it all their own way, and they launched a fierce counterattack against the Allied flanking force. The counterattack was led by a group of Tiger II tanks, which had been held in reserve until now. The Tigers were almost invulnerable to the Allied tanks, and they began to wreak havoc on the Allied lines. The Allies were forced to call in air support, in the form of P-47s, which dive-bombed the Tiger tanks with rockets and bombs. The P-47s were able to take out several of the Tigers, but not before they had inflicted heavy casualties on the Allied infantry. As the sun began to set, the battle was far from over. The Allies had made gains, but at a heavy cost, and the Germans were still fighting fiercely. The Allies were experiencing supply line issues, communication failures, and a lack of situational awareness, all of which were taking a toll on their morale and effectiveness. The Germans, on the other hand, were fighting on their own soil, and they were determined to defend it to the last man. As night began to fall, the Allies regrouped and reassessed their situation. They had taken heavy casualties, but they had also made significant gains. The Germans, however, were far from defeated, and they were planning a major counterattack for the night. The Allies knew that they had to be prepared, and they began to dig in and fortify their positions. The night phase of the battle was about to begin, and it would be the most intense and brutal phase of all. The Germans launched their counterattack under the cover of darkness, using their knowledge of the terrain to outflank the Allied positions. The Allies were caught off guard, and they were initially unable to respond effectively to the German attack. However, as the night wore on, the Allies began to regain their composure, and they launched a series of fierce counterattacks against the Germans. The fighting was intense and chaotic, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Allies were using a new type of weaponry, the M1 bazooka, which was a portable anti-tank rocket launcher. The bazooka was highly effective against German tanks, and it played a significant role in the night phase of the battle. The Germans, however, were using their own brand of weaponry, the Panzerfaust, which was a handheld anti-tank grenade launcher. The Panzerfaust was highly effective against Allied tanks, and it caused significant casualties among the Allied armored units. As the night wore on, the battle began to take on a life of its own. The Allies and Germans were fighting in close quarters, often hand-to-hand, and the outcome was far from certain. The Allies were struggling to maintain their supply lines, and they were experiencing communication failures, but the Merry were determined to push on. The Germans, on the other hand, were fighting for their lives, and they were determined to defend their soil to the last man. The stage was set for a final, decisive confrontation, one that would determine the outcome of the battle and the course of the war. The aftermath of the pivotal 10 minutes that changed the course of World War II was a complex and multifaceted phenomenon that would have far-reaching consequences for the world. In order to understand the significance of this event, it is essential to examine the turning point that led to the victory, the cost of the war, and the legacy that it left behind. The turning point of the war was the result of a combination of factors, including the bravery and strategic thinking of the Allied forces, the mistakes made by the Axis powers, and the impact of weather conditions. The Allies' ability to decipher the enemy's codes and gain valuable intelligence played a crucial role in their ultimate victory. Additionally, the Axis powers' underestimation of the Allies' strength and determination proved to be a fatal mistake. The weather also played a significant role, as it hindered the enemy's ability to launch an effective counterattack. The specific weapon that tipped the balance in favor of the Allies was the deployment of advanced radar technology, which enabled them to detect and respond to enemy movements more effectively. The cost of the war was staggering, with casualty statistics that are still daunting to this day. The Allied forces suffered over 100,000 casualties, including 25,000 fatalities, while the Axis powers lost over 200,000 men, with 50,000 fatalities. The destruction of infrastructure was also catastrophic, with entire cities reduced to rubble and key industrial centers severely damaged. The war effort required unprecedented levels of production and mobilization, which put a significant strain on the resources of the participating nations. The human cost of the war was not limited to the military personnel, as millions of civilians were also affected, with many losing their homes, livelihoods, and loved ones. The legacy of this event is still felt today, as it changed the face of modern warfare forever. The development and deployment of advanced technologies, such as radar and code breaking, raised the stakes, and changed the nature of warfare. The war also led to a fundamental shift in the global balance of power, as the United States emerged as a dominant world power, while the European empires began to decline. The aftermath of the war saw the formation of the United Nations, an international organization dedicated to promoting peace and preventing future conflicts. The war also led to the development of new international laws and norms, such as the Geneva Conventions, which govern the conduct of warfare and the treatment of prisoners of war. The impact of the war on the global economy was also significant, as it led to a period of rapid economic growth and transformation. The war effort required massive investments in industry and technology, which helped to stimulate economic growth and development. The post-war period saw the emergence of new economic powers, such as Japan and Germany, which would go on to become major players in the global economy. The war also led to a significant increase in international trade and cooperation, as nations recognized the need to work together to prevent future conflicts and promote economic development. The social and cultural impact of the war was also profound, as it led to significant changes in the way people lived, worked, and interacted with each other. The war effort required the mobilization of entire societies, which led to significant changes in the role of women, minorities, and other groups. The war also led to a significant increase in migration and displacement, as people were forced to flee their homes and seek refuge in other countries. The post-war period saw the emergence of new social and cultural movements, such as the civil rights movement and the women's liberation movement, which would go on to shape the course of modern history. In the years that followed, the world would never be the same, as the consequences of those 10 minutes continued to unfold. The war had unleashed a new era of technological advancements, global interconnectedness, and unprecedented levels of destruction. As the world struggled to come to terms with the aftermath of the war, it became clear that the true cost of conflict was not just measured in lives lost or cities destroyed, but in the profound impact it had on the human psyche. The war had shown that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope, always a chance for redemption and forgiveness. And yet, it had also shown that the capacity for destruction and chaos was limitless, that the darkness that lurked within the human heart was always waiting to be unleashed. As the world looked to the future, it was clear that the legacy of those 10 minutes would continue to shape the course of human history, a reminder of the devastating consequences of war and the enduring power of the human spirit. The world would never forget the lessons of World War II and the devastating consequences of those 10 minutes that changed the course of history, leaving behind a haunting question that would echo through the ages. What is the true cost of peace, when the price of war is paid in the blood of the innocent, and the future of humanity hangs in the balance, forever trapped in the abyss of time, where the past, present, and future converge, leaving us with a chilling realization that the next war is always just a moment away, waiting to unleash its fury upon the world.